To me, if I were the negotiator, I would say yes. That took some of the chits, that you put on the table to negotiate. It's taken some of those and put them in the Russian pocket. Uh,
From the Times, this is The World in 10. With me is Jim Townsend, the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for European and NATO policy, someone well versed in transatlantic security policy after decades at the Pentagon and at NATO. Jim, welcome.
it's great to be here. Thank you.
Donald Trump's call with Vladimir Putin seems to wave the starting flag on negotiations over Ukraine's peace, perhaps. Are today's announcements from the White House and the Kremlin a good thing?
Well, it's a good thing that a lot of things that have been happening behind the scenes are now maybe will be a bit more public. It's obvious that they've been talking, both the Washington and the Moscow teams, and also with Zelensky. There's been some conversation with him. We know now that, in fact, Putin and Trump have been talking. So now that they've come public, if you will, it's good that we're going to start seeing what the outlines of an agreement could look like. And is it a ceasefire? Is it a peace agreement? We don't even know that. So let's get this thing going.
It's been a big day for people who are concerned about the future of Ukraine. A lot of people in Europe are digesting what's been a bombshell speech by the new US Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth. What do his comments mean, do you think, for NATO?
Well, I think for NATO, it means that NATO is not going to be part of this situation up there in Ukraine one way or another. I mean, according to Hegseth, the U.S. will not support Ukraine joining NATO. The U.S. will not send troops to Ukraine to take part in any security guarantee that might be part of a force, a NATO force up there, or a coalition of willing. Obviously, the White House says it's not going to be a NATO force. We're not going to take part in that. It's going to be a coalition of the willing, and the U.S. will not have boots on the ground there. And if this force is attacked by the Russians, if they were to reattack Ukraine, this will not come under Article 5 as far as the U.S. is concerned. So for NATO, it means that NATO is not going to be a player in this. For Europe, it means that Ukraine is now squarely on their lap to deal with.
So no NATO membership for Ukraine. Why do you think the US would rule this out so specifically? What's the gain here?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. What do we get from Putin by being so upfront and confident in saying that? This is something that in the past administrations, the Biden administration particularly, the idea of pulling Ukraine in was a matter of time. But now the Trump people have taken that off the table. So the question becomes: in a sense, these are concessions to the Russians. I'm sure Putin said, "Look, I'm not going to even talk if Ukraine is going to get into NATO or if NATO is going to have troops in it." And so I think the president must have agreed to all those things. The U.S. is not going to be involved in it now. So what did in return for that? What did Putin say they would do? Come to the table, maybe, or what? I don't know. But we need to find out. Was this something? Were these concessions given away for free, or did we get something in return?
Do you think this weakens the Western position unnecessarily by giving away these things, taking away threats that could later be used against Mr. Putin?
Well, to me, if I were the negotiator, I would say yes. That took some of the chits, that you put on the table to negotiate. It's taken some of those and put them in the Russian pocket. And so I would say that certainly weakens your negotiating hand. But we'll have to see. We've only gotten little pieces of the story. J.D. Vance is going to give a speech at the Munich Security Conference in a few days. Let's see what he says. I would imagine he'll fill out a bit what the plan is. So we'll have to wait and see to hear that speech.
Hegseth was very firm in saying no US troops in Ukraine. But if European troops who were peacekeepers there were attacked, Article 5 would not come into play. As someone who has a long association with NATO, do you think that that's a legally sound position?
Yeah, it's legally sound in terms of the United States saying if this even came up in NATO, an attack has happened against European and other forces in Ukraine. and some of the allies come to NATO and say we feel this should be in Article 5, the U.S. has already said we would say no. We would not join consensus on something like that. And so, yeah, I mean that's what we're doing is we're signaling ahead of time what the U.S. view would be in terms of allied forces being attacked in Ukraine, but it's not a NATO mission. That's what Hegseth also said, that this would not be a NATO mission. So Article 5 wouldn't apply anyway.
Ukraine's President Zelensky, as you say, also spoke with Mr. Trump today. It seems after Putin's call. How do you think this and Mr. Hegseth's speech will be considered by Ukrainians today?
Well, if I were Zelensky and his team, I think the speech has knocked the props out from under Ukraine and under Zelensky. Essentially, he said, "Look, this war isn't going to end in favor of Ukraine. This is a lost cause. We need to end this war. We're going to cut a deal with Putin, and Ukraine might as well reach an understanding within itself that they won't be able to return back to those borders before 2014." And so I think right now, I heard Zelensky said, "We're not ready to give up. We're ready to keep fighting." I certainly understand that's where Ukraine is and where Zelensky is. Politically, that's where he's got to be too, by the way. So we'll just have to see. But it doesn't sound like things are going in Zelensky's way.
From your position in the US, do you think it's fair that Mr. Zelensky might be thinking this US-Russia entente comes at his country's expense?
No, but I don't think he's surprised. Donald Trump, in a lot of ways, has said that's going to be the way it's going to go. It's not going to be the Paris Peace Accords or the Congress of Vienna or surrender on the USS Missouri and Tokyo harbor. I mean, this is something where he's going to cut this deal. He'll keep Zelensky informed and eventually come up with something probably that's going to be a take it or leave it type of thing, I would imagine. Same thing with Europe. I'm not sure Europe is going to have much voice in this either. But we'll just have to wait and see. This is the starting gun, as you said, has gone off, and so we're on our way. So let's see where this ends up.
Of course, many in Europe are still thinking about Pete Hegseth's speech. Our defence editor here at the Times, Larissa Brown, says one source she spoke to in the UK Defence Ministry said he didn't go as far as they thought he was going to. Were you expecting more or less than we got today?
I was expecting less. I thought it was a little early to be so specific about certain things because you negotiate, and you don't give up things ahead of time. And in fact, he did. And there you go. So, yeah, I was a little surprised that this was as specific on these points about U.S. engagement. I was surprised that was part of the discussions this early today.
Secretary Hegseth's also set out his reason for his comments as the US needing to counter the threat of China. Is that a fair point? Is it necessary for the US to pivot completely to Asia or mostly to Asia, pivoting to the Pacific rather than the Atlantic?
Well, for us, yes, that is a top priority is China. But that doesn't mean it has to be done at the expense of what's happening in Europe. I think we can do both. And so I think trying to make China our exclusive focus and saying to Europe, okay, good luck, over to you. I'm not sure how realistic that is either. We're going to have to be a part of the European scene. We're going to have to work with the allies to get them strengthened so they can play more of a role. They're working towards that end now, but they're not there yet in terms of military capability. So there's still a lot of work ahead before we can just do a handoff to Europe and say, you do Europe and we'll do Asia. But that's kind of where the administration's going.
Does this fit in with that idea of the America first foreign policy, or is this a departure from what you expected from the new Trump administration just a few weeks in?
No, not really. To him, America first means what our interests are first, and our interests right now, according to this administration, is China. And so America first means our interests first. Our interests are China. We're going to do China. Russia is secondary, and we have allies in Europe that will take care of that while we try to handle our top priority, which is China. So that's his thinking. That's the America first approach.
Jim, finally, what's your sense of how Korea officials at the Pentagon will be looking at Mr. Hegseth's speech today?
Well, they also depend on the United States, the way Ukraine has depended on the United States, the way allies also depend on the United States. So I'm sure they're hopeful that one day they will not also find the administration knocking on their door and saying, our America First agenda means not Korea, but it means China, and it means doing some things that involve pulling U.S. forces out of South Korea. I'm sure they hope that they're not caught up in something where suddenly they're not a priority. In fact, they're a bill payer, if you will, for U.S. forces to be put into the fight against China instead of being there to help them against North Korea. So we'll just have to see. But I'm sure they are anxious as they go in to talk to the administration here in Washington.
Jim Townsend, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome.